Good afternoon. Well, welcome to the first event of the year for the Jeffrey Chia Institute. I'm Thye, the lucky person who is undeservingly the head of this think tank. I'm very pleased today to tell you that this is the beginning of a year of very meaningful programs that we have put in place. In the rest of this month, on the 25th of January, we will have a talk on the compatibility between the democracy and Islam. That, given the disappointment after the Arab Spring, I think is a most timely topic. This event would be co-hosted with the Islamic Renaissance Front and the Group of 25. I hope, since Monday, January 25th is a holiday, it's a good day to wake up to start the day with an intellectually challenging seminar. Then on January 28th, we will have a panel on how Malaysian universities should adjust to the forthcoming budget cuts. The speakers would be Garth Jasmine and Vincent Wong. We still have more to come, and we hope that if you don't already have your email addresses, please do leave it behind so that we can get in touch with you. I open this new year by introducing to you my longtime friend since 1989, Professor Chung-Ming. Welcome. This is his first trip to Malaysia, and so being a good host, I'm trying to make it a pleasant one. So, what could a host do to ensure that his guests have an enjoyable time, especially in facing the usual critical Malaysian audience? I could think of two things I should do. The first one was straightforward. In order to make him look good, I should speak first. So that's the easy one to do. The second thing to ensure is that whatever he speaks upon, he cannot be shown immediately to be wrong, or it would not strike you immediately to be wrong. So this means I have to pick a topic in which there are no facts. And the only way that there are no facts is we talk about the future. This is why the topic today is the world economy in 2016. There cannot be possibly any disagreement on the facts because there are none. So that will be my way of making Professor Kuan feel welcome. Thank you. In talking about the future, any speaker faces the following choices. Should one choose to be clever, or should one choose to be correct? Because being clever is something that the audience can almost immediately recognize. Whereas being correct is especially about the future, makes it impossible for the audience to recognize it to be so. So inevitably, the best thing for a speaker to do is to choose to be clever in talking about the future, rather than to be correct. And what does it mean to be clever? To be clever means you always forecast a disaster ahead. Always forecast a disaster. Because if the disaster were to happen, everybody would remember you having superior insight into the process. If the disaster were not to happen, everybody would be impressed by how influential your words were in provoking the authorities to take preventive actions. But in line with the mandate of JCI, we have chosen, both of us, to hopefully to prove to be correct. I think that we are now in the middle of a semi-panic in the world. Yesterday, the Royal Bank of Scotland issued a newsletter which basically say, sell every stock you own and move into cash and bonds. Well, they are certainly following what I said, being clever when talking about the future. I think my reading of it is, this RBS call for action, we should think of RBS as standing for royal bullshit. Largely because I think that it is true that conditions for most countries in the world will be less rosy than today. It's a worsening of the conditions we are in. But however, the future is not lost, because I do believe that there are a number of quick corrective actions that would be done in a number of these countries. In other words, the challenge is, would these countries be able to turn their crisis into what I call a good crisis? In other words, instead of being passive victims of the disaster that is upon them, they shape actively the future that they could face. So this statement I could make confidently about 2016, that the condition will be worse in most countries, is largely because I think it's too late to prevent this situation from happening in most countries. These are forecast by the World Bank from two issues of their annual economic report. One economic report was in January 2015, and the second one was issued in January 2016, which meant that all of these reports were prepared in the final months of the preceding year. As you could see, their forecast for the world in line with the worsening conditions in 2015 is that the World Bank has reduced its estimate for economic growth of the world in 2016 from 3.3 to 2.9, and 2007 from 3.2 to 3.1. For the United States, which suffered a tumble of 0.7 percentage points, they have lowered the forecast for 2016 by 3 percentage points, while sensing that the US has turned the corner in the main. And I would say the US has roughly turned the corner, and it is unlikely the conditions would be much worse in 2007. In fact, I of all of the countries I'm going to speak about today, I'm most optimistic about the United States, and I'll explain why. For China, the second most important engine of growth in the world, economic growth this year has come below what the government had forecasted it to be by 0.2 percentage points, small, but it is anticipated that 2016, the growth will be lower by a greater extent And similarly, there would be continued lower growth in 2017. In the case of Malaysia, we see that the World Bank thinks that this year and next year would be at least half a percentage point lower than what they had forecasted. Of course, any forecast is dependent not only on a forecast of external conditions, it's a forecast on what internal actions would be taken. And most of these forecasts are, I think, based on a rather pessimistic reading of what the governments could do in these countries. My talk today will have 4 sections. The first, I quickly review the period of unconventional monetary policy that we have gone through, the period of quantitative easing. I think that quantitative easing has brought with it recovery in the US, but threats of greater financial instability in the rest of the world. The second topic I'm going to talk about would be what the post-Obama years are likely to bring to the United States. And for China and Malaysia, I think that they both stand on the cusp of a turn for the better. Or if they do nothing, they would continue the slide downwards. So let's get to conventional monetary policy. Monetary policy usually consists of the central bank buying and selling government bonds. Unconventional policy talks not only about the large-scale buying of government bonds, it also means that the central bank buy assets, which it has not done before. Specifically, Ben Bernanke, in a paper written by 2002, in which he blamed the stagnation of the Japanese economy on the cowardly behavior of the Bank of Japan. For him, what it meant was that the Japanese should not have just driven the interest rate of short-term government bonds to zero. They should have gone on to drive long-term government bonds to zero. And if that was not good enough, they should go in and drive private corporate bond rate to zero. And if that's not good enough, go in and buy equities on the stock market. He thinks that this scaling up both in quantity and in quality, moving into different asset classes, would surely succeed. That's why he ended the paper with the joke that if none of this work, you put the money in a helicopter, fly over Tokyo, and throw it out. Well, if you look at what has happened since 2008, Ben Bernanke has effectively gone step by step of what he said the Japanese should have done in 2002. He has gone pushing short-term government bond rates to zero, long-term government bond rates to almost zero, and went into large-scale buying of privately issued bonds. In fact, at one point, he stood on the verge of entering directly into the stock market. Why is it that governments have generally prohibited their central banks from buying up the stock market? Why? What is the reason for doing so? The reason for doing so is that for central bank to buy stocks, is the equivalent of arbitrary confiscation of private property. Because all the central bank does is print a piece of paper and then it swapped it for the ownership certificate of firms and private assets. So what Ben Bernanke has said is basically, in extraordinary times, you do extraordinary things. And being emergency medicine, it means that it could work for a while, but in the long run, it is deleterious to the health. I would say this is exactly the situation that China and Malaysia faces. China did a big macroeconomic stimulus in 2008 that revved things up, prevented China from sliding into a recession. But on the other hand, it was a stimulus that carried too far for too long, and hence creating the fiscal crisis and financial crisis that the state is facing. Similarly, in Malaysia, well, it is fortuitous that today marks the anniversary of the death of an individual, of Tun Razak, who performed emergency medicine after May 13th, 1969, where in order to create social stability quickly by scaling up the Malay middle class with the new economic policy, and he and Tun Ismail realized that that was emergency room medicine. That's why the introduction of the NEP, they put a time limit of 20 years for it. And I think today we stand at whether this emergency room medicine has gone on for too long. The previous doctor who was in charge had chosen to strengthen the dosage, such that NEP has now morphed into no economic progress. But back to the United States, and then more into China and Malaysia. One thing for sure, for a central bank to expand the amount of working capital in the economy, the most direct instrument is to make sure that there are more deposits into the commercial banks, and then the commercial banks transform all these short-term deposits into loans. Because what's a financial crisis? A financial crisis is when solvent firms that have order in hand, are unable to get working capital to carry out production. That is what is transform a financial crisis into an economic crisis. Firms are unable to get working capital. So when the Lehman Brothers failed and many banks were on the verge of bankruptcy, which would mean a complete disappearance of working loans from the economic system. Both the United States and the United Kingdom undertook massive monetary stimulus in the form of huge purchases of government securities, exchanging government security, taking government securities from the hands of the private sector and giving them the cash to deposit into the commercial banks. That is what economists call M0, high power money. As you could see, the United States under Bernanke acted very swiftly. The amount of high power money went up 100% by the end of 2008. Compared with the previous years, you could really see this is unconventional policy. In the United Kingdom, the crisis swept in early 2009, and by the end of the year, the United Kingdom had also increased high power money by 100%. And China seemingly carried on business as usual. What's the outcome of this huge injection of high power money into the system? Was it translated into working capital for the economy? What we see was that for the United States, because the financial crisis only erupted in September 2008, that only brought the growth of working capital by 8%. But 2009, there was actually a drop in the amount of working capital in the bank. In other words, what we have normally called the money multiplier has turned zero, if not negative. In the case of UK, it was zero. The central bank dumped all this money that went to the deposits of the commercial banks, and the commercial banks failed to translate that into working capital. Why didn't quantitative easing work then? If you understand why it didn't work then, we can think about how it worked in subsequent years. The reason it did not work is because most textbooks have a missing element in the explanation of the creation of credit. Let's look at the balance sheet of a central bank. Of a commercial bank, sorry. The balance sheet of a commercial bank. Let's take the easiest case. Keep the numbers easy. Let's think of the required reserve ratio is 10%. Think of the capital adequacy ratio as 10% to keep the numbers easy. So if we think of the bank as having 100 million in deposits, it would be required to keep 10 million of it in required reserves, lend out the other 90, but because the bank had also put in capital, the bank could lend it out. So basically, the bank could have made loans of 100 and kept 10 of it in required reserves as needed legally, and then hold 3 of it in excess reserves. So this would what a balance sheet would look like. Now, what was the Lehman Brothers subprime crisis? The Lehman Brothers subprime crisis is basically, you look at the loans, these are the assets of the banks. The banks could have been holding mortgage-backed securities. And if people default on the mortgage payments, the mortgage-backed securities fall in value, with much of it to zero. An excellent movie on this just came out recently, The Big Short. I recommend it for your entertainment as well as education. It's a great movie, The Big Short. But in any case, what happens if 10 million of it goes bad? If 10 million of it goes bad, straight away the value of your loans is cut down from 100 to 90. And the bank has to take a hit on its capital because that's a real loss. So the bank's capital goes down to 3. Now, what happens when the bank capital goes down to 3? Now this bank can no longer meet the capital adequacy ratio. With a bank capital of 3, the maximum it is allowed to have loans in outstanding is 30. But it has got 90 outstanding. So what does the bank do? Call in the loans or not roll over the loans that become due. So basically, the banks want to reduce. The banks would wish to reduce the loans from 90 to 30, putting the 60 into the excess reserves. In such a situation, an open market operations would mean the government bought bonds from the general public, and then the general public deposited into the bank. more deposits into the bank cannot be translated into loans because the bank cannot meet the capital adequacy ratio. And because they could not meet the capital adequacy ratio, additional deposits would not be translated into loans. This is why the immediate medicine of quantitative easing in 2008 and 2009 failed in Western Europe and in the United States. What was needed immediately then in order to get working capital out there to the public, the fastest way is to recapitalize the banks. Because if the banks were recapitalized, then, like for example, if the government were to take away the non-performing loans of 10 from the banks, and then take it at face value, buy it as if they were good loans, and give from the banks, then the bank's capital would go back to 13, and if the bank's capital would go back to 13, it would be able to resume its normal operation. So what has been happening is, for quite a while, the banks were unable to lend more despite the great inflow of deposits from quantitative easing. But what quantitative easing really allowed them to do was investors could take out loans at 0%, almost 0%, and buy bank stocks. Or the bank owners would be able to take this almost zero interest rate loan and recapitalize their banks. So that is the way that quantitative easing would work. But on the other hand, many bankers, especially for banks that are owned by an individual, he may choose not to recapitalize the bank. Because in a time of crisis, the bank stocks are selling at low prices. If he were to offer additional stocks, he would lose control of the bank. And many would choose to retain control of the bank rather than to recapitalize the banks. But in any case, the important thing is this low interest rate allows indirect recapitalization of the bank system over time. The government could have done it faster, but in the case of the US, saving the banking system also translated into saving the bankers. Basically, we just have a situation where there was quite a bit of fraudulent behavior by the banking industry, and no one has gone to jail for the fraudulent behavior that caused the bubble boom. But there is a book out now by Atif Mian and Amir Sufi, which basically said, besides recapitalizing the bank, besides saving the bankers, another possibility would have been just subsidize the mortgage holders who were in trouble. Because if you had subsidized the mortgage holders who were in trouble instead, the loans would not have gone bad, and these people would not have lost their homes. So basically, at the time of the crisis, Bernanke faced the choice of bailing out the bankers or bailing out the mortgage holders. And he chose the former. So we should go back on to talk about why the crisis happened. But basically, it was when you see the movie The Big Shot, The Long Shot. No. What is it? The Big Shot, right? The Big Shot. So sorry. SHORT, not SHOT. Right? Yes. Okay. It has to do with wrong macroeconomic policy by Alan Greenspan. In other words, all of that fraudulent behavior would not have resulted in the explosion of the subprime market if the central bank had not kept interest rate so low and allowed liquidity to expand. The reason why Alan Greenspan allowed liquidity to expand so much was because he was following the old rule of if inflation goes up, raise interest rates. If inflation doesn't go up, just let the money supply continue to grow. After all, the lesson from Milton Friedman is keep your eyes on interest rate and the market will take care. No, keep your eyes on the inflation rate and the market will take care of itself. What was wrong with that policy was that this was formulated at a time when China had isolated itself from the world. When the time of Alan Greenspan corresponded with the integration of China into the world economy. Basically, there was a great outward shift in the global supply of goods. So it means that when the US spend too much, instead of driving prices up, you just import more. Whereas in the old days, when China did not exist, if you spend too much, the price will go up. But in this case, if you spend too much, price will not go up because additional goods would flow in from China. And the Chinese did not turn around to take the reserves accumulated and did not use it to buy American goods immediately. They held it as reserves. So what that happened was, as the US expanded its money supply, prices didn't go up, he continued to let it ride. And the outcome was that despite the hollowing out of America with the rise of China, what was the rise of China? China was industrializing. And when China was industrializing, that meant that they were producing a lot of the same industrial goods that the US was making at a lower price. And after China joined WTO in 2001, which meant that China had guaranteed access to the US market, American firms realized they could shift whole scale to China, make the products there, and ship it back to the United States. So, in this situation, the expansion of money supply could not cause inflation, but it did one thing. It hit the unemployment that was created. It postponed the appearance of unemployment. Because I just told you two things. One was the integration of China world economy and the moving of US production to China. So what happened to the people who were previously employed in the factories of the United States? These are low-skilled labor. When we think of the US economy, what are its growth engines? These are the high-tech industries. You cannot tell a 40-year-old man to retool to become a computer programmer. I'm sure Malaysians boleh, but in most parts of the world, that's almost an impossible task. But yet, throughout this process, unemployment did not go up in the United States. Jobs are leaving, low-skilled jobs are leaving, but the unemployment rate did not go up. How was that possible? That was possible because it also this period of easy monetary policy coincided with the proliferation of mortgage-backed securities. There was a housing boom that absorbed the low-skilled labor. It does not take much skill to hammer a nail into wood. So there was a huge real estate boom, and together with the furnishing of homes and of the service sector, restaurants and other service industries, that absorbed the release of unemployed workers from the US, from the US industries. So when the housing bubble burst, people were laid off from the construction industries. They now have to look for jobs, but the low-skilled jobs had moved to China. This is why the recovery of the United States this is the unemployment rate. As you can see, the unemployment rate in the United States has gone up and gone down. But the difference between the crisis in 2008 and previous jumps in unemployment rate is the slow rate at which the unemployment rate came down. Compared to previous times, the decline in unemployment rate from 2008 is much slower than before. And how is the unemployment rate reduced over time? Well, unemployment rate is reduced over time not because a lot of the 40-year-old workers became computer programmers, but it's because they got older and many of them took early retirement. What you see there is the labor participation rate of the US. Today, the US has the lowest labor participation rate since women started joining the labor force. From the 1950s to the 1990s, you see the huge rise in the labor force participation rate. That is because of the working mothers. Basically, this is why there could be such a big rise in the participation rate in the labor force. Women now are educationally empowered to take high-paying jobs or higher-paying jobs. But we do not see women deserting the workplace. Despite the absence of that, we see a decline in the labor force participation rate. This has to do with the discouraged worker and of workers who are 50-something-year-old taking early retirement in the US. This is the primary force that's driving down the unemployment rate in the United States. So in that sense, the United States has digested its unemployment problem over time, because aging has pushed a large part of the problem into retirement. And the big challenge is, what do the children of the low-skilled workers do, given the fact that the jobs of their parents have largely disappeared? That has shown a failure of leadership in the United States, where instead of expanding aggressively the education sector to train the young ones for the jobs in the future, instead they have mostly responded to the fiscal crisis of the state by cutting education across the board. That is an adjustment that is unfortunate, but nevertheless, because of the high average income in the United States, many people are able to tighten their belt and still continue to push their children through school. In retrospect, we have seen that the Fed moved in because the banks were too big to fail. But now it is interesting. Now that Bernanke is no longer in charge, he recently said many of those bankers should be in jail. But why didn't he do anything about it when he was in charge? It's just like many past judges in Malaysia now telling us about, oh, what is going on is not this, or should not be this, should not be that. But why didn't they do anything about it when they were in charge? Anyway, the lesson there was the banks were too big to fail, and the bankers were too big to jail. So let's move on to sum up the flaws of the quantitative easing. Is basically it was a real boom to the rich bond buyers, and it basically, when adopted by the rest of the world, was a competition in devaluation by the different countries. The United States, the point of origin of the crisis, now has a stronger dollar than when the crisis happened. Immediately, in fact, 4 months after the crisis, the US dollar was stronger than the day before the crisis, and has continued to be stronger. So there is a threat, a small threat of future inflation. But on the other hand, I'm quite confident that would not happen because Janet Yellen is a very competent central banker. Let's talk, and what is the big difference between the 1929 crisis and the 2008 crisis? After the 2009 crisis, there was a complete change in government regulation of the banks, putting very heavy restraints on what they can do and what they cannot do. We do not see it after the 2008 crisis. This is because in 1929, the bankers were wiped out. They were too weak to organize to resist. In 2008 crisis, we bailed out the bankers. They have stayed strong and they have resisted the regulation of the industries. So that means that the perverse incentives that existed to create the bubble still exist today. Now let's move quickly on to China. And the two things, what we are seeing in China is that it's paying the price for two things. It's paying the price of one, the huge stimulus that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao undertook in 2009-2010, and it is the result of their failure to undertake economic reform during the 10 years in office. To summarize, if you want to think of one simple depiction of what is happening in China and how that could be kept and how to capture it, think of the following development that happened in the 2008 to 2013 period. In this 5 years period, China managed to put in place a comprehensive high-speed train system that covers almost the entire country. In a period of 5 years, they were unable to undertake this massive, massive infrastructure construction. How was it possible? Because in order to build all of that infrastructure, they needed to scale up dramatically their supply of cement and their supply of iron and steel. And they did. In the period between 2008 and today, the amount of cement that China used up is greater than the total amount of cement the US used up in the 20th century. That was the amount of cement that was poured in China. We come to the following question. If the cement plants were privately owned, would the private owners have scaled up production to the extent they did? I think any private owner of a cement plant would think of what happens after I fulfill this order for the high-speed train. Who am I going to sell to? If you do not see a customer who's going to demand an equivalent amount of cement, it's unlikely you would scale it up to that level. Most likely you tell the government, I cannot supply you so many cement, you better turn your 5-year plan into a 15-year plan. because I'm only going to increase it incrementally by so much. Because after 15 years is over, the economy has grown enough on its own, I could then sell the excess, what I have increased in capacity, to the normal working of the economy. So what that meant was this creation of excess capacity is what that is plaguing China. And when people talk about macro stimulus, they are saying we could increase up demand to use up the existing capacity. But the trouble is, how many high-speed railroad systems do you want to build? This is one reason why China has gone on the One Belt, One Road strategy of external engagement and start up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We will build your infrastructure for you. Why? Because it's also good for us. We got to use up our cement and our iron. So that captures right away the difficulties and the reluctance of the government to undertake fiscal stimulus. Because fiscal stimulus means you raise demand to use up existing capacity. But you have existing capacity in industries that are not viable in a market setting. So fiscal stimulus is not the right thing. What you should be doing is a program of adjustment to let other parts of the economy grow while you roll back the iron, steel, and other industries. This is where politics meet economics. Because most of these firms with excess capacity are state-owned firms, and state-owned firms, like everywhere in the world, as in Malaysia, they are instruments of political patronage. They are not instruments of economic construction in the long run. So the structural adjustment in China requires that Xi Jinping reduces the benefits that are presently enjoyed by a sizable group of the Chinese elite. And we could talk so the basic China is the excess capacity, but more importantly, it reflects the ability to create the excess capacity came from the firms being state-owned rather than privately owned. If the firms were privately owned, they would never have agreed to scaling up production, to scale up investment to the level that they actually did. So China faces the question of to continue its conversion from a state-dominated economy to a private market economy. The government tries to do it. The new engines of growth that should come about would be to reform the factor markets in China. The market for final goods in China are largely free, but what is not free are the markets for capital, the market for labor, and the market for land. This is the important reform agenda facing for China. You should think of China since before 1978 as a spring that has been pushed down by state policy of central planning and state ownership. And Deng Xiaoping's secret was to release the spring by replacing central planning with the market, replacing state ownership with more private ownership. That has always been the engine of growth, allowing what was natural to occur, the uncoiling of the spring. The Hu Jintao era was one of stability rather than concern over growth. So Hu Jintao sat there, sat on the spring, and kept it from freeing itself. And when they do try to do something, they have unfortunately done it wrong. One of the most important reforms in China is certainly to allow people to move to places where they can improve their life. In other words, there is no voting in China in the voting booth, but there is also no voting with your feet to go to the place where you can have a better life. Basically, they have freed up the hukou system, which is the household registration system that forces you to stay where you were born. They have freed it up, but they have freed it up for the cities that do not grow as fast. They have not freed up for Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, Shenzhen, Guangzhou. These are the places that people want to go to. They do not want to go to Xining, Lanzhou, or Guizhou. These are the places where they have freed up the hukou system. This, I think, is basically the main difficulties that China face. For the case in Malaysia, I think in this audience, the facts need very little dispute. We can this is 1970, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to make the font for the years bigger. It is 1971 to 2014. That's the GDP growth rate from 1971 to 2014. And what we see is there are two norms, roughly. One norm is around 9%, 8.5% from 1970 up to 1996. Roughly from 1970 to 1996, you can draw one line, and the rest are fluctuations around that line. And then you can draw another line at roughly 5% from around 2000 onwards. So there has been a drop in what I call the normal rate of growth of the Malaysian economy from 8.5 to 5. And what is the main reason for the slow drop in the growth? We can think of many, many reasons, but they all have to translate into one thing. Growth means expansion of your productive capacity. And in order to increase the productive capacity, you either have a big improvement in technology or you got a big investment. And what we do see is this the investment rate in Malaysia, and this is from 1963. As you can see, 63 to 70 was under 20%. In 71 onwards, is over 20%. 1970 was the beginning of the Malaysian industrialization, because that was the time when the Karakan government in Penang invited foreign multinationals to make Penang an export manufacturing center. And when all the other Menteri Besar in the state saw that all you got to do is put out the welcome mat and make it comfortable for them and tell them that you can drink the water from out of the tap in Malaysia, unlike all the other neighboring countries, these companies looking for cheap labor will come, and they came. And that big jump in that fixed capital formation is the result of inflow of FDI, plus the fact that Malaysia discovered oil in the early 70s, and with that oil, we could afford to build many, many, many things. So boom, that's why the capital formation rate is so high. Then from around 2001 to today, we see there's been a big blip, that there's been a fall in investment, and the investment is under 25% mostly, except in 2002 2012, 2013, and that is largely because those were election years. And that was Pemandu's task. So if you were to look at the composition of investment, the first thing to note is that drop has to do with a drop in FDI and a drop in private investment. You do not see an equivalent. In fact, you see a desire by government-owned companies and investment in the budget to prop up the investment rate. So there has been a decline in private investment, especially in FDI, and that has to do with 2001. Why is 2001 such a turning point? Because that is the year China joined WTO, and China had guaranteed access to US and Western European markets. Before China joined WTO, every year it faced the possibility of being shut up from these markets. And so most of the FDIs switched over. So what Malaysia faces now to get out of the crisis is that little blip we saw in investment in 2012, 2013 was due to, that's why I call the 1 MDB effect, right? Borrowing by our GLCs to kick up investments. I think that our state sector, as in China, has gotten too big. The government now even go into the business of buying up successful private companies. That is basically killing the golden goose that's been laying the egg. And unless we are able to unleash the private sector by removing various kinds of restrictions, and unless we can pull back the monopolization of the economy by the state sector, we are not going to achieve higher long-term growth. A big issue today is TPP. Should we be for it? Should it not be for it? Against it. The issue on TPP can be summed up in the following simple example. Suppose I own two businesses. Business A would make $200 million more with TPP, but business B would lose 100 million ringgit with TPP. Should I agree to TPP? Since one firm goes up 200, the other firm goes down by 100, the answer is obviously yes. But what if I don't own both firms? I own the one. Mr. A owns the firm where the value goes up by 200, and Mr. B owns the firm that goes down by 100. Should the country still join? The question is, the country should still join if with zero political objection, if the government is able to put in place a mechanism of paying off the loser, helping the loser to adjust to what is happening. After all, the firm that does well makes 200, and the firm that lost 100. Isn't there a way to transfer some of the gains from the winner to the loser in the short run, get the loser move into another line of business, and then everybody is better off? What Malaysia has not done so far is to talk about what are the adjustments mechanisms we need to lessen the pain of adjusting to the gains of TPP. People talk about the more expensive generic medicine that would come. Medicine. Couldn't the government be able to have a temporary subsidy of medicine until it is able to, since the government is almost always the biggest buyer of medicine in this country. It is able to bargain with the multinationals for a lower price. But until it achieves that bargain, it could subsidize or at least keep the price of medicine from rising to what it would be in the when TPP comes into effect. So there'll always be arguments about how big are the gains and how big are the losses. My gut feeling is the gains exceed the losses. The question is, do you have a way of distributing the gains such that suffering is minimized? And I think that this is the failure in the policy and in the discussion on TPP so far. I end with the statement that growth and industrialization came to Malaysia in 1971 because one state came up with a new idea and all the other states and the federal government follow along to that idea. Basically, what you need is multiple centers of independent policy initiatives. Good ideas does not come from the central government alone. Now we have a country where many of the key states are ruled by different parties. We should let these new parties show whether they are worth re-electing or not by letting them do their stuff. If they are unable to come up with industrialization and economic growth policies for their state adequately, then the voters can judge them accordingly. But right now, policymaking in Malaysia is just too centralized. Like, for example, you cannot extend the runway in Penang by 200 meters for the last 20 years because the federal government didn't want to. The federal government decided to build a longer runway in Pulau Langkawi. And of course, the tourists, the Scandinavian tourists, instead of being diverted from Phuket to Langkawi, they were the first went from Penang to Phuket because the Penang runway was too short for a fully loaded airplane to take off to fly non-stop back to Scandinavia. So they fled to Phuket. And then when we built that runway in Langkawi, they stayed in Phuket. But I think that if the runway would be extended by 200 feet in Penang, especially given its new status as World Heritage City, much of that Scandinavian traffic would come back. And when the state government says, we will pay for it, the only trouble was it's a federal airport. Just because you got money, you think you can extend the runway. So basically, I think there has to be a new thinking about, given the new political realities in Malaysia, we need a new federal state compact to allow multiple centers for policy initiatives, in addition to unleashing the private sector. So today, I end on the notes have begun. Tun Razak undertook emergency medicine to greatly increase the size of the Malay middle class. And now the question is the son going to undertake equally bold actions to unleash the Malaysian economy into a normal pattern of economic growth with institutional reforms that could realize Wawasan 2030. So, before I end, I'd like to wish my big brother happy birthday because he's sitting in the audience today. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Professor Kuan, who will now tell you about a more rigorous version of what you will see in the future. Professor Kuan has not always been an academic. Before, until a few years ago, he was the Minister of Planning in Taiwan for 4 years. Professor Kuan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank Professor Wu for having me here. And I always feel pressure to speak after Professor Wu. He's such an energetic, insightful speaker, and he usually does not leave too much time for me, which actually is much easier for me. So I'm going to take the next 30 minutes, hopefully, to talk about what I think about the economic outlook in this region. I was an economics faculty at the National Taiwan University and also before in Illinois. So I really care about models and numbers. So I would like to give my quantitative assessment, and especially some of the topics you might be interested in. And I will leave those qualitative interpretation to Professor Wu, so I will be safe. So as an introduction, I will use the IMF report on the world economic outlook to start with, to show how the international agency to see what was going to happen in 2016. Then I would like to address some of the issues I believe some of you must be interested in. Okay, first, in Asia, who matters the most? I think this, which one?
Page display.
Single page? Yeah. I think that's the one. Okay, let me try another one. I think that will work. Hopefully. Yeah, that's okay. I almost forgot where I was. You know, the sign of aging. First, I would like to address the issue, who matters most in this region in Asia? And I will introduce a tool we call trade war maps to show so that you can visualize which economy is more important. But using trade map is more like descriptive statistics. So I will going to analyze exactly what is the impact of mainland China and the United States on different economies in this region. Then based on this assessment, we can do this some forecast adjustment. Since IMF already have those numbers to forecast what happened in 2016, as an individual researcher now, so I don't really have the capacity to redo everything. So we use this as a tool to make a forecast adjustment based on the impulse response. Then I will make some remarks on what I think we can do in this region. So the IMF's report, and it shows that global growth in 2016 estimated at 3.6% growth, in contrast with 3.1 in 2015. But they also mentioned that there will be uneven growth across countries and regions. And of course, there's always a different growth in advanced economies, in emerging markets. There are some of the issues that IMF mentioned explicitly about the world economy may be affected. The first is about China's economic transformation. While in the new 5-year plan, that China's mentioned that they are going to pay more attention to consumption and the services in contrast with those export-oriented manufacturing. And also the fall in commodity, in particular oil prices, may cause another uncertainty in the future economy. Another is possibility of U.S. interest rate to be raised in this year. And based on those observations, IMF makes such a forecast. I actually put IMF, World Bank, and OECD, and some other agencies forecast together. So you can see that the IMF forecasts 2016 like 3.6 versus World Bank's 2.9. And in estimating the growth of the United States, the different agencies have quite similar forecast. IMF actually gives the highest. But as for the forecast for mainland China, and IMF actually gives the lowest forecast. You probably know that Chairman Xi Jinping mentioned about in the following years, China should actually look at the average growth rate at 6.5%. So those forecasts on mainland China's growth actually reflect different views on future economy in mainland China, while OECD is just average. Say, Chairman Xi says 6.5, then he projects 6.5. While People Bank of China, and obviously is more optimistic, and estimated at 6.8, and while IMF estimate lower at 6.3. Another two big economies that in the euro area that IMF, the different agencies, they give very similar estimates, and also for ASEAN countries, whether that is ASEAN 5 or ASEAN 10. Now, since we already have those numbers, what can I do? So I actually put this as academic research. So I start to look back, look at the question, who matters most in Asia? Because people already have some belief that in recent years, which country plays a more pivotal role in Asia. So let me show you some trade maps. As a real economy, I use the trade to reflect the relation between those economies. So in the following maps, you're going to see circles. Circles will represent different economies. The larger the circle, meaning that the market is more important relative to its trade partners. And also, I also use the color. The darker the color means that the market is more important. So color and the size should grow at the same time. And also there are arrows. Arrows reflect how much you export to your trade partners. So the thicker the line, that means more export to that particular economy. So from those lines, arrows, circles, you will see, you will be able to visualize how those economies are connected, how those trade networks are related to each other. And also, I'm using this program to show this so that trade between two economies, they will have attraction. So a larger economy tend to attract the nearby, those economies who have more trade with it. And of course, there are also some repulsion that will kind of push those economies away. So it takes a while to have the program really settle at the equilibrium. But it's informative, I hope. Because there's a lot of maps, so I pick up several years. Here is 2004, then 2007, 2011, then 2014. So there are basically 35 economies in the database. So you can see the larger one in 2004 is the United States, while Germany is second, and China and some other large economies like UK, France, Netherlands, and Japan. So they all connected in different ways. But roughly just visualize, you probably can tell United States is the center of the world trade. But things gradually change throughout the years. I will show some more detailed maps in a minute. This is 2007. You can see Germany continues to grow, while China also grows. While UK, France still remain major economic power in Europe, Japan pretty much smaller than mainland China, but you will see thicker line connected to the United States. Some lines become thicker connecting to mainland China in Asia. That's 2007, so 8 years ago. This is 2011. then China actually grow to a size comparable with the United States. Now you also observe more lines and the thicker lines connect to China, while still connecting to the United States. So you can see, as far as trade is concerned, you will see really the role that China has been playing in recent years. Here is 2014. While Germany is still large, but the two major trade powers is actually the United States and the mainland China. But there are too many nations and too many lines. It's not easy to see. So I'm going to show you some in detail. But before I'm going to summarize this a little bit. From the plots you have seen, basically throughout those years, the United States remains the center of the world trade. While in Europe, Germany plays a role like an attractor. Because you saw those the European economies were attracted, connected to Germany. While UK, France, Netherlands maintain certain balance between Germany and the United States. In Asia, China has emerged as a comparable power in the world trade since 2011 and started attracting more and more Asian economies. You will see the lines connecting to China become thicker. No matter what, Japan always keeps certain distance from China. It was never attracted closer to mainland China. But on the contrary, you will see India is large economy, but it's always remote in the world trade map. Some ASEAN countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, is always kind of in a remote position. But Japan somehow keep the distance from China and the United States, somehow kind of balance there. So I get rid of some of the nations so that we can easily see a better connections. So I take out those some smaller European nations, some of the nations like Canada, Mexico, those in South America, then we get a cleaner map. Then this 2004, without Canada, Mexico, then the United States in 2004 is of size similar to mainland China. But that simply means that with Canada or Mexico included, the United States, this circle could have been much larger. But here it's easier for you to see how Asian nations were connected at the first place. So you can see the one closer, mainland China is like Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, while some other Asian countries maintain certain distance. But the things change rapidly. That's 2007. And that's 2011. And that's 2014. Then you can see Indonesia is still on the outside. India is always like remote, it's playing by itself. But China definitely, from this, you can see it becomes a major player in Asia. And the Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, of course, Singapore is more like a transit export. But the Taiwan, Korea are the two economies closest to mainland China, and with the very thick lines. And Australia become thicker, then those lines become thicker in recent years. And then Malaysia is always kind of like in the middle. It is not as close as close to mainland China as Taiwan or Korea, but it's closer comparing to other Asian economies. To summarize, then we can see China roughly has been an attractor since 2011, more Asian economy being attracted and become closer to China. Before that, mainly connected to the United States, and some of them are even closer to the United States. And relative to the size of mainland China, United States has been shrinking. It means its market for Asian economies is not as important as it used to be in recent years. And from here, you can also see Germany become much smaller. This doesn't mean Germany is not important. It simply means Germany's trade is largely dependent on intra-region trade. So once you get rid of the other European economies, Germany becomes much smaller. But the mainland China obviously is a major player, remains a major player in Asia. And Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, like I mentioned, are major exporters to mainland China. Indonesia and the Philippines are remote economies. Malaysia is somewhere in between. And no matter what, Japan always try to stay away from mainland China. So to summarize, we can say as far as trade is concerned, China actually matters most in Asia, and its market attracts several economies in Asia, but definitely not all of them. Some economies always keep a certain distance, Japan, the Philippines, and Indonesia. But are those trade maps telling us everything about the relation between those economies? Then to answer this question, then I resort to a model called the global VAR. In econometrics, we use a multivariate time series model we call the vector AR model. But in order to study a bunch of countries, such a model becomes much too complicated. And there are too many parameters to estimate. So we need a way that we can still link different countries together, but without really estimating so many parameters. So we use Pasaron's work, this joint work by D. Smaron, Pasaron in 2007. They call this global VAR. Basically, it's just like a standard vector autoregressive model, but they always add a certain foreign variable and using certain international transmission channels to link those foreign variables. So in our case, we use trade as a weight to link different economies. In some other study, we can use the similar thing to link the different financial market based on the financial volatility. And because it's a vector AR model, we will be able to calculate impulse response. So what do we mean by impulse response? Basically, impulse response is the reaction of a dynamic system in response to an exogenous, unexpected shock. So this plot simply shows once you have a certain signal in, through certain dynamic system, it's going to generate certain impulse response. For example, if some unexpected shock happening in the United States, through this global VAR dynamic system, we will be able to assess what's the response of different economies to this shock from the United States. Of course, we can do the shock from mainland China, shock from different economies. But from the world trade map, we're going to just focus on the shock from the United States and China. And of course, I'm not going to overwhelm you with equations, so I just show you the result. So here we give the estimated the first period, like 1 period we had the impulse response of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. The blue means the response from the US shock, while the red bar shows the response from the China's shock. So you can see, basically, United States still play a more important role. That means one unit of unexpected shock happened in the United States will generate a response in the next period, still outweigh the response coming from mainland China's shock. And Taiwan obviously has the largest response. This ASEAN 5 plus Singapore. So basically, you will still see that the United States still exerts much larger impact than China's shock. Of course, some exception, but the effect much lower, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Of course, these results are quite different from what we just observed from the trade maps. People may wonder, when we see trade map, we see that mainland China play a more and more important role, while the United States, the market has been shrinking. Then how come the United States will still have a larger impact? So basically what the model does is that they already take into account the relation between different economies, while also the international trade as a weight to connect those different economies. So that, in other words, the effect of trade between those economies have been taken into account. So whenever we say there's one shock into the system, we mean something that cannot be accounted for by the trade relations. Now, of course, then we can imagine the United States, they still influence Asian economies in many different ways. Like Professor Wu mentioned about the monetary policy, those unconventional monetary policy, and the potential rising interest rate in the coming year, like I mentioned in the beginning IMF report, they all become some uncertainty that may affect the economy in this region. So not just those monetary policy, even political power, those are something that cannot be quantified by trade. They may still play a certain role in affecting the economic performance. So what the model can show here shows that the United States, the unexpected shock will still generate more impact on like Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore. Singapore aside, but you can see Malaysia has the largest response from United States and from China compared with the nearby economies. So to summarize, so what we did using this model is that after controlling foreign variables, including economic growth and the trade, then what we show is an unexpected shock of the United States still have a larger impact compared with the effect coming from China. And among those Asian economies we just showed, Taiwan has the largest response to an unexpected shock from the States and the China. Among ASEAN 5, Malaysia has the largest response, but Taiwan's response is still greater than that of Malaysia. That simply suggests Taiwan have a closer tie with the United States and mainland China, and of course through trade and perhaps through other channels. So we use trade maps and those numbers to show who matters most in this region. Then since now we already have those what we call the impulse response, then we know once there's a shock in, and we know how much the economic performance would be affected. So we can use this, we take an IMF forecast as a benchmark, then we can talk about what will happen if mainland China does growth as much as IMF projects. Then we can base on this to adjust the IMF forecast. So we can set up a mechanism to make a forecast adjustment. To evaluate the possible effect from China and the United States, let me summarize this. Most of the numbers we show in the beginning coming from the IMF or from World Bank are based on the end of last year's report or early this year. So we only have the new information is from like December or January. So we don't really have much information. So really on no ground, we can really make adjustment of those IMF forecasts if we consider that as a benchmark. But there's still some new information, like the PMI. So we have the PMI from National Bureau of Statistics and the Thye. And you can see the PMI is below 50 for consecutive months, and showing that the manufacturing is still weak. And in terms of CPI and the PPI, you can see CPI only has very mild growth in the past year, while the PPI actually have negative growth for two consecutive years. In terms of the export, which is the major drive force of China's economy, then 2015 is actually almost negative 3 points growth. And except 1 or 2 months exception, most of the month we get a negative growth. So that means China's export was not as strong as years ago. Putting this all together, we found mainland China, they suffer some problem with weak manufacturing and the consumer demand. The PMI shows that the manufacturing would be weak. It was weak, and so far that it doesn't show any sign of recovering, while the CPI only had a weak increment, the very low growth, while producers' price index has been negative growth. And in fact, we also see further pressure on even lower inflation, including the housing market. Now, if you read the news, you see those local government, they issued different new policies, try to save the housing market. And also the policy of dumping of excess capacity. Those dumping of excess capacity simply suggest that they are going to help your GDP, but may give further pressure on prices. And just like I mentioned, the sluggish external demand, which gives the negative export growth in the past month. And in fact, we don't really see there's a significant sign showing the world trade will be recovering or mainland China's export will be further growing. So putting this together, there's not unreasonable to project that mainland China's growth may not be as optimistic as what the IMF projects. But on the other hand, the United States is doing quite well. That we have a steady recovery. Looking at the statistics, you see the improving labor market and housing market. And we also observe quite robust consumer spending and some growing investment in non-oil private sector, which shows that United States' recovery is on a steady path. Of course, there are still some downside risk, probably resulted from the strong dollar and also the sluggish external demand. But basically, if I would like to make a judgment, I would say the United States probably will remain the same as the IMF predicts, while the mainland China may suffer some loss from the benchmark. So based on this judgment, of course it's subjective, we tried a different scenario and using the number we got for the impulse response. So imagine that's another 0.3 percentage point decrease in China's GDP growth rate. Then how those economies would be affected. Like Malaysia would be dropping from 4.5 to 4.3 something. Taiwan will be dropping from 2.6 to 2.46. Thailand will have only minor influence on Thailand's economy. Korea will also be affected a little bit. But suppose that mainland China's economy, because of the current policy, especially you recently see there are some highly volatile exchange rate market and the stock market, showing that there are some kind of uncertainty people did not project at the end of last year. So there could be an even larger decrease in China's GDP growth rate. Then here we give you an estimate, also based on the impulse response, that what will happen, there's a 0.5 percentage point decrease in China's GDP growth rate. Then Malaysia's economy will drop to like 4.27, while Taiwan will drop to less than 2.4%. And another scenario is that with the 0.5 percentage point decrease in China, with 0.1% increase in the United States, that means China will do better than what we originally project. Then you can see that will partly compensate the negative impact from mainland China. Of course, I don't really want to just show you this number. So what I'm trying to show here is that it's just a way that how can we make adjustment about those existing forecasts. Here I'm using IMF as a benchmark. I can easily do the same thing based on the World Bank's forecast or do another set of adjustment based on like ADB's forecast. Now, so after knowing this, of course, one may ask, then what can we do? So in view that is the potential negative impact from mainland China, let me show you two maps I took from the earlier World Trade maps. Here are coming from the map, I just get rid of some of the lines so that you can easily see what happened in Asia. This is 2004. I get rid of those American and European economists. Now you can see this is what happened in China, in Asia. You see most of the line connecting to Japan. Some of them, like Taiwan, Singapore, mainly connected to mainland China. Let's jump to 2014. I'm not sure what did you observe? Aside from those lines connecting to mainland China, and still have some lines connected to Japan. You see, if you really go back to the previous earlier maps, you will see one of the problems in Asia trade networks is that most of the economies mainly connected to the United States. If within the region, they connected to Japan, to China. Some of them to Japan. That means you see very few or light lines connecting those economies within the region. That means intra-region trade is really weak. Actually, they have been weak throughout these years. So those ASEAN economies, actually not just including Korea, Taiwan, those economies were there. They get economic growth mainly by serving the US market. So that's why those connections to the United States are serving the Chinese market, so the connections to mainland China. So this actually gives us a suggestion, what can we do in order to overcome the negative impact from those economies. So the first point, like I just mentioned, those Asian economies are mainly connected to China, but intra-region trade has not been strong. Now, given that China's economy in 2016 looks gloomy, which will result in negative impact on those economies, to offset such negative impact from China, I think what the economies in this region should do and should have done before is that to strengthen the intra-region trade. I believe this is also the purpose of that the ASEAN country upgrade to AEC. Become a newly more integrated economic entity. The intra-region should have more activities. Just look at the Europe. Even though Germany serves like a tractor, but much of the trade was based on the intra-region trade. So I believe that in Asia, or in ASEAN in particular, should have something similar to strengthen the intra-region trade. And of course, taking the advantage of China's policy, like a One Belt, One Road policy, that's another way that this region can upgrade their infrastructure, which is another way to boost ASEAN economy. For ASEAN economies, from those impulse response we estimated, we noticed that Malaysia and Thailand, they have some impact. Mainland China and the US will have certain impact on that. Some other Asian countries do not have as much impact from these two countries. But in order to really balance, I believe that Malaysia in particular can play a more central role in this region, while they can build up a closer network with nearby economies and therefore will be able to offset the negative impact from China and perhaps also the impact from the United States. Okay, so this is what I can offer today using those maps and the numbers, so that I hope you can get an idea about who matters most and to what extent those economies may affect those economies in this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kuan. We would like to open up the floor for discussion. So there are mics available. Let me invite comments and questions from the audience. Sir, please. Or kindly state your name and ask and point out who you would like to ask questions to. Off. Oh, Albert, hold on 1 second. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Albert, and I work for one of the Sunway business units, which is in the hospitality hotel business. I consider myself to be involved with an export industry where we serve to attract foreign visitor arrivals into the country. Now, the one thing that I notice is missing from all of the trade markets that have been represented earlier by Professor Kuan was that we depend at least a quarter of our total business coming from the Middle East, more specifically the Gulf states. How, if I may ask, important is the Gulf states economy, and what is the future of the Gulf states economy going into the next 3 to 5 years? Because intra-regionally speaking, whilst we are getting some business from Singapore, we all know that Singapore as a market does not offer the volume that we need in order to organically grow our business. So Middle East being one, and whilst here we are talking about the United States and Europe, we all know that much as Professor Wu was talking about the Scandinavian market, but we all know that as far as the Scandinavian market is concerned, they're looking for clean waters, they're not looking for shopping malls or theme parks that we offer here. Now, we know that China continues to promise us for our export industry, foreign visitor arrivals into the country. But as far as China is concerned, for us, there are obviously Malaysia, we are attracting some parts of it, but we are by no means on the top of their shopping lists. So my question, I guess, would be number one, how would the Gulf states and the Middle East factor for us? I'm bringing us closer to home rather than to talk about the macroeconomic situation. My question is more micro in nature. And remember that whilst the hotel itself attracts, and 25% of my total business is coming from that one block, our other associated business units that are linked to the hotel, be it the shopping, retail malls that we have, or whether we are talking about the theme parks that we have, they would benefit from the spin-off that we bring in. And I would really like to hear as to where the Gulf states and the Middle East markets come into play. Thank you very much.
Let me ask for more questions. The reason is I want to make sure that we both look good. When we take more than one question at a time, then we can answer only the questions that we do well. Okay, we won't forget you, Robert. Hold on. Second question. Yes.
Hi.
Okay, wait. The lady, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Liana from University of Malaya. My question is to both profs. In your forecast, there's no mention about inequality. Although you did mention that in China, there's all these elites. I think every country has got some elite people. But my question is, one, what is your forecast about inequality in our economy? And two, what are your recommendations to reduce the wealth inequality in societies in Asia?
Thank you. Well, let's begin.
Okay, shall I go first?
Of course.
Okay, first I will have to admit there's a limitation about the World Trade Map. First, there's only Saudi Arabia was included in the map. The database, we do not really have all the nations in the database. And also, it does not really reflect something like tourists or some other service because the numbers are mainly based on the trade of goods. So I'm afraid this trade map will not be able to show what you expect it to show. But of course, we may want to establish another map based on, say, service trade. Then that will show something different.
Yes, the Middle East, I think, is a very important market. And the Malaysian government has certainly make it easier for them to visit us. However, there is likely to be a slight downturn in the future because the Iranians now will be able to visit the rest of the world easier with the easing of sanctions. So for the Middle East, because of Iran has always been a big market for us, I think that might have some possible diversion from us. But on the other hand, with the lifting of the sanctions, they'll be a lot richer. And so that's the income effect that they'll come to us. Malaysia is certainly exotic enough because most tourists like to eat familiar food in exotic places. And Malaysia certainly can offer familiar food to the Middle Easterners as well as to the mainland Chinese tourists. So this is what, but how, in the case of China, I think we could ease up a lot on the visa requirements. Now we have this very silly policy of 0 visa fee, but you still must apply for a visa. Is it because we need to create a job for the visa officer? Couldn't he have better things to do? But there are artificial barriers to our tapping of the Chinese market, which when you think about the concerns that are in place, for example, I don't think we need to worry much about terrorists coming from China, which is a big consideration because as we sit here talking, right now Jakarta is under attack by bombers and 6 people had just rode in by motorbikes, bombing and shooting in the center of Jakarta. So I think for the case of the hotel business, I think that Malaysia has only become much more attractive. That's the upside of the down ringgit. The issue of equality is a fundamental one because inequality has increased greatly in almost every country of the world in the last 20 years. You can see its impact on the US most easily by the continued resilience of Donald Trump as a candidate. He is the candidate of the angry, unskilled white man. He truly is. We face an age of populist politics. They'll be sparked off by this large gap in income distribution, which is politically destabilizing and could lead to bad economic policies. There are no quick fixes to inequality. Malaysia fixed racial income differences with an quick emergency quota-based system, but it is important to know that there should be, it's just like after CPR to get the heart going, you go on maintenance medicine, things that strengthen the body naturally. So for fixes to inequality, one of the biggest things that could be done is to empower the poor. The poor could be empowered only through raising their productivity, which means giving them good education and good health. We have had so far put an emphasis on quantity in education. I think now we have to move to quality. And quality in this case, in the present globalized world, means the internationalization of our curriculum, where we recognize languages to be the medium of transmission of our cultural values. What is important is that we are able to maintain, enrich, and propagate our cultural values, not propagate the language alone. So I think that the issue of equality exists not only in Malaysia, but in the world at large. For example, the lot of the difficulties that France is experiencing, for example, the attack in Paris recently, it has its basis in the Muslim ghettos that surround the big, large European cities. They become breeding grounds for political dissatisfaction with the economic inequality. Yes.
I would like to offer some of my thoughts about inequality, even though this is not the focus of today's talk. Okay, inequality has been a long-time issue, and just like Professor Wu said, not just in this country, but it's a worldwide problem. I consider there's one important thing for what the government can do regarding the inequality. I think housing policy is very, very important. Usually, I consider inequality, there are two types. Those actual inequality that can be calculated based on, say, something like a Gini coefficient and the Oshima index. That only shows those income inequality based on those numbers. But there are some mental inequality. You own something that I don't. That create a kind of inequality, and when people feel depressed, much because of this. Because in terms of the real money, it's difficult that you to compare every household in terms of the money. But if you own a nice house, but I don't have any, this mental inequality is important, which creates a gap between generations or between groups. So housing policy, if properly designed, can ease this problem to a large extent. So at least younger generation or poorer groups, they will have hope. Then even though inequality, you cannot completely get rid of inequality, but a nice housing policy should be able to ease this to a large extent.
We have that gentleman and then Professor Mahendran. But while we're waiting for the phone, I'd like to say that inequality is addressed by a package approach rather than any one single silver bullet. And the inequality has been with us a long time, always does. But what is concerned is the drastic worsening of it in the last 20 years.
Yes, I noticed that maybe it's not important in your consideration, but in other areas, in other places, I noticed that you talk about geopolitical risk coming from the Middle East, coming from Ukraine and elsewhere. That's my first question. How important are geopolitical risks when you do things like economic forecast for 2016, for example? That's question one. I take this one to ask question two is that in the chart there, I just noticed right in front of me, strengthening the intra-regional trade. For example, the Asia Economic Community, we're almost down to zero on the tariff rates, but the problem is the non-tariff barriers that is troubling a lot of industries and services in the region when they try to promote intra-regional trade. And the third thing is, whilst I'm talking about risk analysis, at the micro level, it has become a legal issue, for example, in the United Kingdom, whereby if companies nowadays coming from a judicial case recently, if companies and directors do not perform risk analysis adequately, sufficiently, and carefully, they can be disciplined. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk from both of you all. This talk is about the future of the region and trade. Two things are going to shape the trade flows in the region. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where China is excluded. And the second important factor that's going to drive the trade flows in the region is essentially territorial disputes and the claim of China on the Southeast, the China Sea. And there's a lot of tension in the region. How do you see over the next 3 to 5 years this playing out in terms of trade and the broader geopolitical dynamics in the region through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and also with the American influence and the territorial disputes?
Yes, we are in the middle of a new Cold War. On two fronts. One is in Eastern Europe. That's what the war in Ukraine is all about. And the other one, with different actors, is in the South China Sea. The one in Ukraine is likely to cool down a little, largely because the Russians have much lower capacity to finance that war now, and because of the low price of oil. For this region, the impact on us depends on the intensity of US-China rivalry. At a very low level of intensity, where they can get along and they can settle things among themselves, they will ignore us. On the other hand, at a middle level of competition, then they are trying to win friends and influence people. They will both come bearing gifts. For example, China has just paid higher prices for something sold by 1 MDP than they otherwise would have. And China is building the high-speed railroad between Jakarta and Bandung in a period of 3 years rather than 5 years promised by the Japanese, and with no government guarantee that the Japanese had asked for. And closer at home, we certainly had got political benefits. Obama played golf with our Najib, right? So Obama was certainly on the ball on this one. And the United States was so eager to show its commitment to the area that it started these TPP negotiations. But it's very embarrassing for the United States to start a club where there are no members. So in order to make sure there are members, they have bent over backwards in giving exemptions to Malaysia. For example, they allow us to keep our government existing government procurement system. There's no level playing field. In other words, we can discriminate against American suppliers, just as we are able to discriminate against certain domestic suppliers here. And they also allow us, they also do not impose anti-monopoly measures on state-owned enterprises. In other words, opening the market of dominated by state-owned enterprises to Americans. They make that as an exception for Malaysia, but not for other countries. So if you go on, Malaysia has had a TPP package where they have to do much less adjustments than otherwise what did they call this? A world-class trade pact or something, level playing field, less pain, but also in this case, less gain. Less short-term pain, but less long-term gain, because we would not have as efficient an economy as we otherwise would have been. But less short-term pain is good because we're in a political sensitive period right now in Malaysian history. So the rivalry between them has brought us benefits because it's low level, middle level and rivalry. If it's high level rivalry, then I think we are screwed, because for the simple reason, the attitude of both of them at a very high level of intensity is like the Cold War. If you are not explicitly on my side, you are against me. And in such a case, we don't get to choose sides, they choose the side for us. So that, when you talk about geopolitical thing, it really depends on the level of the intensity of the conflict. What is going to happen with TPP? My prediction is China would tell one of its friends within the TPP, because TPP will expand over time, and say, hey, nominate me for membership. Do you think the US can say, no, you cannot be a member? When 3 ASEAN members said, we would like to nominate China for membership. And I think China, in a few years, will be very, very ready to join. Largely because any organization that it joins, by its pure size, it could come to dominate. So it would balance what's happening. I think we have talked about geopolitical risk. We talked about internal reforms. One clear and present danger that we have not identified so far, but is being felt in the US right now, are the El Nino generated storms that are causing large property damage. I think Malaysia so far has avoided much severe and more frequent natural disasters. But there are things like, what is a higher level of income if we continue to breathe all that dirty air that was in this country for several months in 2015? Basically, we have to talk about regional environmental control. So when we talk about regional trade pact, we should also be thinking about regional sustainable development pacts.
I would like to add a few words about the intra-region trade. Actually, I had the trade maps before that, dating back to like 1980s. Actually, throughout these years, the trade pattern in Asia changed just a little bit. Virtually none or very few intra-region trade. I think largely because of the economy style in those countries. Many of us are mainly producers for those components of industrial goods. Taiwan is also one of the examples. Very few of us produce those end goods. So largely, we in Asia produce things so as to export to the States and to Europe. I think that after all these years, after the economy being developed for so many years, this type of a model should have been changed. That means economies in this region should start serving each other. If we still continue our just factory, the only purpose for our economy is to serve those advanced economies, I believe those trade map will not be changed. So only when we start looking at the different things, I would like to serve Professor Wu, and while Professor Wu is willing to do something for us, then we'll have different trade patterns. But they're really depending on the business leaders. Especially in ASEAN countries, there are so many important events and organizations working here. I believe this is something they should promote. I also believe that RCEP and also the recent upgrade to AEC should play this role to really encourage intra-region trade by changing the economic model. I think that's important.
It is past 5. I think at most we take is one more questions. Yes.
My question, Professor Hu, you mentioned about China having massive infrastructure development for the last 2014 and things like that. Do you think our size of our economy, Malaysia, do you think we will be able to sustain the coming massive infrastructure development, such as the MRT2, LRT3, and high-speed, the kind of high-speed train to Singapore? Are we learning from the mistake of China, as what they are experiencing now, rather than, we go ahead with the massive infrastructure development and 5 years later we will suffer? Do you think we can sustain that kind of development? Thank you.
My name is Tan Siok Chu. I'm from United Malacca, perhaps. And my question is this. Do you agree with George Soros, who said recently we are moving towards 2008 crisis? Thank you.
One thing for sure, traffic congestion is approaching crisis proportion, if not already in Kuala Lumpur. There has to be a solution. Now, mass rapid transit. We clearly need better public transportation system. What are we? The question is, what kind of mass transit transportation system? Buses, subways, LRT? I think that whichever we choose, the thing to remember is almost every developed country in the world subsidizes public transportation. It is a money-losing proposition in the enterprise itself, but the benefits it generates from the entire economy are much greater than the losses of that enterprise. The New York subway loses millions of dollars each year, but by freeing up the flow of traffic up on Manhattan Island, Brooklyn, and so forth, it gives more time for people to work, get around, interaction, and so forth. It creates a lot of gains. Having said that, it doesn't mean that all infrastructure are good. There could be bad ones because they're built for reasons of corruption and designed for reasons of corruption than serving the purpose that they are supposed to be for. A good case would be Japan. Japan builds high-speed train stations to places where hardly anyone go. That was the stimulus package, which was basically political patronage to the construction industry. And infrastructure has to be environmentally friendly. So that is very important. So I would say, yes, Kuala Lumpur needs badly, or rather Malaysian people deserves better public transportation. Otherwise, we'll be forcing people to drive on the sidewalk to get anywhere, as they do in Jakarta. So I do feel that it will be a money-losing proposition, but it will give people much more time to engage in productive activities. Now, on the high-speed train between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, it will be a money-losing proposition, but what will it do to businesses in between the two of them? I think that it could certainly greatly increase the investment, businesses that are in Singapore to move to the Klang Valley, number one. And number two, let me point out another thing. How would you like to have a telephone system where there are only two lines, me and you? We each have a phone and no one else. Versus a telephone system where there are, all of us are on it. Clearly, a telephone system with more people is much more valuable than just a system between you and me, and proportionately more than just a doubling or a tripling. So the high-speed railroad should go all the way to Penang. Building a high-speed system is doing a half-ass job. I think that growth needs to be distributed and be to Penang, not with so many stops, because I think that it cannot be high speed if you stop too often. You've got to limit the number of stops. On the question of are we heading towards a meltdown, I think that if you look at, for the case of China, the meltdown has already begun and is in and has happened. And in the case of the United States, I think that the meltdown or the correction that we have seen, I think is sufficient to adjust to what's been taking place. Largely because what caused the last bubble was easy money, and now we try to cure the effects of the last bubble by making money even easier through QE. When you think about it, what the disease that killed us, the medicine that killed us the last time, is the medicine that we're using to fix ourselves this time. So basically, we had set ourselves up for a potential bubble. But now, hopefully, with the lessons that have been learned, that is why the housing sector is not as vibrant, it's not so strong as in the United States, except in the key cities of New York, San Francisco, or the major cities in the US are unusually inflated. I think, yes, there is a market correction going on right now, but I do not see a repeat of 2008.
I only have a very quick comment on the, are we approaching the similar situation as in 2008? Personally, I don't think so, because one of the major reasons causing such turmoil in 2008 is because of the systemic risk. But now, we do have lots of money floating around, but one of the major issues is coming from the economy slowdown. And so far, I don't really see the systemic risk like we saw in 2008. So with the current situation, really depending on how different government, in particular mainland Chinese government, and how can they gradually tighten up the budget, make sure that it's a soft landing there, then I believe the market risk can be contained.
Well, thank you all for your patience. This is past 5 o'clock. Before we adjourn for the evening, I'd like to invite the head of the Sunway Education Group, Mr. Lee Wing King, to come up to present a gift to our guest. Mr. Lee will come up. Mr. Lee Wing King.
Thank you very much.
Let me stand in the reflected glory. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.